What does this Kawhi Leonard injury mean for the Clippers? Let's get into this. After being down 0-2 to the Utah Jazz, once again the LA Clippers were able to come back and tie up the series 2-2 with Kawhi Leonard's brilliance. But in that Game 4 game, after Kawhi already had a really good game and propelled the Clippers to a win, there was something wrong with Kawhi and he was sitting out early. There wasn't a specific play, I don't think, that we saw Kawhi really tear his ACL potentially, but just the fact that Kawhi was sitting out in somewhat of a close game down the stretch in the playoffs was obviously something pretty concerning. But now today there have been a few reports out that Kawhi Leonard may have a torn ACL, and this is a huge blow to the Clippers if this is true. Usually when there's reports out that a team is fearing that this player has a torn ACL, usually they do have it, so that's really not good for Kawhi and the Clippers. But let's hope for the sake of Kawhi and the Clippers that he doesn't have a torn ACL, because of course if he actually does, then he's going to be out for the entire playoffs. I recently made a video saying that I personally think the Clippers have a really good chance to make it out of the Western Conference, even when they were down 1-2 in that playoff series versus the Utah Jazz. But now with this Kawhi Leonard injury, that's not going to happen. The Clippers really need Kawhi Leonard if they want any chance making it out of this playoff series and making it out of the West. But let's just say for the sake of the video that Kawhi does have a torn ACL and he's going to be out for the entire playoffs. What happens to the Clippers? So of course first all the pressure moves on to Paul George now, because he has to be that guy that takes his team to the next level, and he's no longer would be that secondary guy that can just stay behind Kawhi and also put up points as well. He's that main guy now. This could actually go one of two ways. Let's start with the positive side. Sometimes when you're playing with a guy who's much better than you feel pressure to give up the ball more often than you would usually do, and you would be a little less efficient on the offensive end because you're not knowing exactly what to do. But now with Kawhi Leonard out in this playoff series at the very least, Paul George is going to feel more confident potentially that he could just take the ball and score the ball whenever he wants and take his shots that he wants to. So we could see a little bit more of a more confident Paul George out there. That's a one case scenario that could potentially happen. And of course for the Clippers perspective, that would be the best possible case scenario. But even if we do see a lot more confident Paul George out there and he's way more efficient and putting up a lot more points than he was previously, he's still going to have to bump up his numbers pretty significantly to actually have any chance in this playoff series versus the Jazz. He's going to need to be averaging at least 30 points per game, at least maybe a little more than 30 points per game, just to have a chance to beat this Jazz team, and he's going to need a lot of help from other role players that need to step up as well. When you're losing a guy like Kawhi, everybody in your team needs to step up and really make up for those 30 points per game that Kawhi was giving you. So that's the first scenario, and for the sake of Paul George and the Clippers, I hope that's the scenario that happens, and for the sake of this playoff series, hopefully we see a good playoff series, even though Kawhi Leonard's not going to be playing in it. When Paul George was originally on the Indiana Pacers and he started to become an all-star and a superstar in this league for the Pacers against the Miami Heat especially, in the playoffs he was known for playing extremely well, and that's why he got the name Playoff P. But for whatever reason, the past few seasons his playoff performances continuously got worse and worse, and then recently in the past 3 or 4 seasons he's been known as a guy who can't perform in the playoffs. But now for another case scenario that I could potentially see happening, and this one wouldn't be good for Paul George and the Clippers, would be now that Kawhi Leonard's out of the game, the Jazz can focus a lot more on Paul George specifically and make it difficult on him. And now if he was struggling before that when he had Kawhi on his team, now without Kawhi it's going to be a way tougher time for Paul George. Because now for the Utah Jazz, they can easily throw double teams at Paul George without even worrying about Kawhi Leonard being on the court and being able to hit that open 3 or mid-range or whatever he's doing. There's not really other guys like Kawhi obviously on that team, so now you could really focus on Paul George. Unfortunately, I personally think the more likely scenario is the second case scenario where Paul George would struggle a little bit more, with the Utah Jazz mainly focusing on him and sending double teams his way, just making it tougher for him in this series. And unfortunately for the Clippers, if this is the case scenario, I definitely don't see them beating the Utah Jazz in this series, even though it's 2-2 and they had a great game in Game 4. Because for me to see the Clippers actually still beat this Utah Jazz team even without Kawhi Leonard and him going down with an injury, Paul George is going to have to be playing absolutely flawlessly, and he's going to need a decent amount of help from his role players like Luke Kennard and other guys on his roster as well. Rondo has to help him out a pretty big, tremendous amount as well. But if Paul George, especially if Paul George is playing extremely poor when they're sending double teams at him a lot, then you have literally no chance of winning this playoff series. But I am a big fan of Kawhi Leonard, and I do like the Clippers because I'm a big fan of Kawhi Leonard. So hopefully for their sake and the Clippers' sake, they're able to pull out this series, but I'm not too confident in that. But now with Kawhi Leonard not being at least in this series, and he's probably done for the entire playoffs, and with that being the case, I personally think the Utah Jazz are going to win this series now, especially due to the fact how well they're playing as a team, and especially Donovan Mitchell is playing insanely well. So without Kawhi Leonard, it's basically going to be impossible to beat this team. But let's just assume for the sake of the video and the most likely case scenario that the Utah Jazz ended up winning this series after Kawhi's out. What happens to the Clippers and Kawhi Leonard in the offseason? Does Kawhi leave the Clippers? Does he stay? What happens with that now? I thought personally after last season so disappointing in the NBA bubble, up 3-1 and losing in the second round to the Denver Nuggets, I thought if they had another very disappointing season this year, then Kawhi Leonard had a decent chance to actually leave the Clippers, even though there have been a few reports out that he has no plans on leaving the Clippers and he's going to stay for sure. I thought there was a decent chance he could leave, but now if the Clippers lose again in this series, I think there's a chance that he leaves because it's a little disappointing again that you're losing in the second round, but this time it's a little bit different. The main reason why last playoffs was such a disappointing season in the bubble for the Clippers was a lot of people had them winning the whole NBA championship, and after it was somewhat of a tough series against the Dallas Mavericks, which not a lot of people expected, going into that Denver matchup, a lot of people thought that the Clippers would beat them very easily, and after they were up 3-1, all these people's thoughts were validated. They're up 3-1, they're not going to blow this, they're going to win. Then we all saw what happened. They blew that 3-1 lead, so the disappointment of blowing a 3-1 lead is incredible, and that's obviously why it was a very disappointing season for them. But also on top of that, a lot of people had them winning in that series and it wasn't even going to be close, but on top of that, a lot of people had the Clippers winning the entire championship. So if they were losing, blowing a 3-1 lead in the second round of the NBA playoffs, that's obviously extremely disappointing. But moving forward to this season, those same expectations aren't there anymore because they already blew that 3-1 lead last season and they've already disappointed pretty significantly. So those same expectations of the Clippers winning a championship this season aren't there, and especially when you're talking about the Nets and how good they are, and a lot of people thought the Lakers are a lot better, so those expectations aren't there. And now on top of that, in the second round, I think they're going to lose again, which is definitely disappointing for the Clippers, but Kawhi Leonard was obviously hurt in this playoff series and not playing for the rest of the series, so maybe in Kawhi's mind, he thinks maybe it's not as disappointing because he wasn't able to play for them this series, and maybe if he was going to play, they were going to get by this series and maybe make it all the way to the NBA Finals and maybe win, who knows. So that's why I think it's a little bit different this year than it was last season. But who knows, we'll see what happens in this playoff series. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe the Clippers are still fine, but we'll see what happens here, and then we'll see what happens with Kawhi Leonard in the offseason. Does he stay with the Clippers? Does he leave the Clippers to go to another team? Hopefully the Knicks, but we'll see what happens. Anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Clippers are done without Kawhi Leonard, and do you think Kawhi Leonard may leave the Clippers in the offseason? Or do you think the Clippers still have a shot in this NBA playoffs against the Jazz and just in general? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe and hit that post notification bell. It really helps me out a lot. And until next time, peace out, guys.